The stone desk shuddered under the impact. Jacqueline slammed her spellbook down, the heavy binding meeting the cold slab with a sharp, echoing crack. Ancient parchment pages fluttered, then stilled, vibrating with a rhythmic, pulsing blue light that bled into the surrounding air. She held her hand flat against the cover, feeling the hum of stored energy clawing to be released. Across the training hall, the air itself seemed to tighten. Dust motes, suspended in the dim light, began to swirl in erratic, circular patterns, caught in the wake of the book's discharge. She didn't look up. She kept her gaze pinned to the swirling ink on the page, watching the symbols twist and realign under her touch. The blue light flared, casting long, jittering shadows against the academy walls. Every student in the room turned, their own practice halted by the sudden surge of power. Jacqueline ignored them all, her jaw set, her breathing steady. The parchment grew hot beneath her palm, a searing heat that promised more than simple classroom theory. She waited for the feedback to subside, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and brittle. Tyke shifted his weight, the soles of his boots grinding against the stone floor. He ignored the lingering blue glow from the desk and turned his attention to the center of the hall. A holographic projection of a dragon materialized in the air, its wingspan wide enough to brush the rafters, circling a burning castle in a silent, looping cycle. He raised his hands, the metal plates on his wrists clinking as he tightened the straps. He flexed his fingers, testing the tension in his grip. The air near the projection shimmered with heat, distorting the light into jagged, flickering edges. Tyke watched the dragon's path, his eyes narrowing to track the shifting trajectory of its flight. He didn't blink. He shifted his stance, dropping his center of gravity and widening his footing until he felt the solid resistance of the floor beneath him. He exhaled slowly, purging the distraction of the crowded room, narrowing his world down to the predator in the air. The dragon's tail swept through a stone battlement in the projection, sending sparks of light cascading toward the floor. Tyke stepped forward, his body coiled, muscles taut and ready to react. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from the projection, feeling the static charge of the simulation prickle against his skin. He was ready. Darius stood on the elevated platform, his gaze sweeping across the floor with the precision of a hawk. He saw the shift in posture, the way the air in the room seemed to bend under the weight of impending action. He raised his staff high, the wood polished smooth by years of ritual use. "Focus," he barked, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers like a blade. The word hung in the air, demanding total concentration. Across the hall, the other instructors stood in a line, their hands clasped behind their backs, watching the students with unblinking intensity. Darius took a slow, deliberate step forward. He did not rush. He felt the cold texture of the stone beneath his feet, grounding his intent. He tightened his grip on the staff, the wood vibrating slightly as it drew power from the room's containment field. He looked down at the center of the hall, where the holographic dragon continued its rhythmic, silent flight. With a sudden, explosive movement, he brought the base of his staff down. It struck the stone floor with a thunderous, resonant impact that sent a shockwave of white light rippling outward. The floor shuddered, the sound echoing against the vaulted ceiling, as the reality of the training hall began to fracture and dissolve under the force of the command. The stone walls of the academy did not just crumble, they dissolved into swirling gray smoke. The ceiling vanished, replaced by a sky so vast and bruised with clouds that it made the hall feel like a tiny, fragile cage. The floor beneath their boots softened, losing its polished smoothness and hardening into uneven, frost-bitten rock. A sudden, biting wind tore through the space, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of snow and ancient earth. The shift was violent and instantaneous. Where there had been light from enchanted lanterns, there was now the harsh, blinding glare of direct sunlight reflecting off ice. The students stumbled as the ground beneath them tilted sharply upward. The training hall was gone. In its place, the jagged, towering cliffs of the Whispering Peaks rose into the clouds, stretching out in every direction like the teeth of a sleeping giant. The silence of the academy was replaced by the low, mournful whistle of wind, whipping through narrow ravines. Every breath taken now was thin, cold, and tasted of iron. The transition was complete. They stood on a narrow ledge, the abyss dropping away into nothingness on either side. There was no going back to the stone floor of the school. Jacqueline braced her hands against the freezing rock, her knuckles white. She looked up and saw the peaks stretching toward the horizon, exactly as the ancient chronicles had described. This was not a projection. The stone felt solid, weathered by centuries of storms that had long since passed in their own time. Tyke moved to the edge of the precipice, his boots crunching on loose shale. He pointed toward a distant, snow-dusted ridge where a series of stone markers stood in a perfect, unnatural line. It was the scouts' vantage point from the Great Siege. Beside him, Darius remained motionless, his eyes scanning the narrow pass below. They realized the truth in the silence. They were no longer students practicing in a hall. They were participants in a moment etched into the bedrock of their world. Jacqueline tried to summon the familiar light from her palm, but the energy surged and bent toward the mountain, pulled by the latent history embedded in the peaks. The magic here was wilder, older, and far more demanding. They were scouts now, tasked with mapping a reality that had already claimed its place in history. Every movement had to be precise. Every observation carried the weight of the past. They turned their backs on the ledge and began to descend into the pass, their eyes fixed on the horizon, searching for the first signs of the conflict they had only ever read about in books. They moved in a tight formation, boots finding purchase on the slick, shale-covered path. The air in the canyon grew heavy, thick with a static charge that made the hair on their arms stand upright. Darius stopped, his hand raised to command silence. The ambient whistle of the wind vanished, replaced by a sudden, unnatural stillness that pressed against their eardrums. A sharp drop in air pressure sent a tremor through the loose rocks under their feet. The mountain itself seemed to recoil. Then it began. A low, guttural vibration started deep beneath the crags, rising in pitch until it tore through the canyon. The sound was not merely heard, it was felt as a physical hammer blow against their chests. It was a roar that rattled the very marrow of their bones, echoing off the sheer rock faces with a terrifying, liquid intensity. Birds erupted from the hidden crevices above, a frantic cloud of wings desperate to escape the source of the noise. Tyke dropped into a low crouch, his hand instinctively snapping to his side. Jacqueline pressed her back against the freezing cliff wall, her breath hitching as the sound refused to dissipate. This was no simulation error. The predator was here, and it was hunting. The echoes of the roar died slowly, leaving a ringing silence that felt more dangerous than the noise itself. Darius pointed upward, his finger trembling slightly as he gestured toward the dense, gray cloud cover hanging over the peaks. The vapor began to churn, swirling in violent eddies as something massive punched through from above. It broke the ceiling of the sky, a golden blur that expanded into a terrifying, singular reality. The dragon emerged, wings spanning the width of the narrow pass, blocking out the sun and plunging the canyon into a sudden, deep twilight. Its scales caught the light, shimmering like molten metal, each plate grinding against the next with the sound of shifting tectonic plates. It drifted on the thermals, a predator moving with the deceptive ease of a shark in deep water. The shadow it cast was absolute, a shroud of darkness that swept over the group, cooling the air instantly. It banked, turning its massive head to track the movement below, its focus narrowing onto the trio standing in the pass. The sheer mass of the beast created a downdraft that whipped dust and loose shale into the air, forcing them to squint against the grit. It did not strike immediately. It circled, measuring the distance, its presence filling every corner of the valley with a scent of ozone and ancient heat. The dragon banked hard, the friction of its wings against the air creating a sound like tearing silk. It circled once more, narrowing the diameter of its flight path until the wind from its passage slapped against the cliff walls. Tyke stood his ground, while the others flattened themselves against the stone. He shifted his weight, his feet planting firmly into the loose shale. The uncertainty that had defined his earlier movements vanished, replaced by a rigid, practiced composure. He drew his blade in a single, fluid motion. The steel rang out, a clear note of defiance against the low, thrumming growl of the creature above. He held the weapon steady, his grip firm, mirroring the stance of the heroes etched into the Academy archives. The dragon noticed the movement. It slowed its flight, wings flared wide to catch the updraft, and it banked inward toward the canyon floor. Its eyes, burning with a predatory intelligence, fixed directly onto the lone figure standing in the center of the pass. Tyke did not blink. He tightened his hold on the hilt, braced his knees for the impact, and watched the golden scales grow larger as the beast leveled its flight path for a direct, closing strike. The dragon did not glide. It dropped. Gravity seemed to bend around its massive form as it plummeted, wings tucked tight against its body. The air displaced by its descent whistled like a gale, pulling the oxygen from the pass. Tyke braced, his blade held high, but the creature ignored the weapon, focusing its momentum into a single, devastating swing. A claw the size of a tree trunk slammed into the shale. The impact was not just a sound, it was a physical blow that traveled through the soles of their feet, rattling teeth and bones. A shockwave erupted from the point of contact, shattering the stone floor into jagged shards. The ground beneath them heaved, turning the solid path into a bucking, unstable surface. Jacqueline lost her footing, sliding toward the edge as the cliffside groaned under the strain. Darius stumbled, his staff narrowly missing a fissure that opened in the rock. Dust and pulverized stone exploded upward, blinding them in a thick, choking cloud. The team scattered, driven by the sheer force of the blow, forced to abandon their defensive line as the earth beneath them failed. They were no longer a unit. They were three individuals scrambling for purchase on a mountain that was actively falling apart. The dragon did not stop its movement after the initial strike. As it pulled its claw back, the air current caught Tyke, lifting him off his feet before he could regain his balance. He flew backward, a rag doll caught in the wake of a hurricane. His back slammed into the vertical face of the cliff with a sickening, hollow thud that echoed through the narrow pass. The impact knocked the wind from his chest instantly. He did not fall straight down. He hit the stone, bounced, and then slid, his palms raking against the rough surface of the mountain. He came to a rest on a narrow ledge, his head lolling back against the rock. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Only a ragged, desperate wheeze as he tried to force oxygen back into his collapsing lungs. He gripped the stone, his fingers trembling, trying to find a purchase, but his muscles refused to obey. He stared up at the swirling dust, his vision blurring. Every breath felt like inhaling crushed glass. He pushed his torso forward, attempting to rise, but his legs remained unresponsive, pinned by the sheer exhaustion of the blow. The mountain wall felt cold against his spine, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the beast, now turning its attention back toward the center of the clearing. Darius did not look back at the ledge where Tyke lay. He planted his heels into the shifting shale, driving his staff deep into a crack in the rock. His hands gripped the wood until the knuckles turned white. He inhaled, a sharp, ragged sound, and began the sequence. His movements were precise, frantic, carving arcs into the air that left trails of pale light behind his fingers. The ground hummed. A low, vibrating thrum resonated through the soles of his feet, matching the intensity of his focus. His face tightened as he pushed his will into the space between the beast and his fallen comrade. A thin, translucent ripple appeared in the air, expanding outward like a stone dropped in a still pond. It was jagged, uneven, and struggling to hold its shape against the heat radiating from the dragon. Darius gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles bulging as he poured every ounce of his remaining stamina into the construct. He waved the staff in a wide, sweeping motion, forcing the flickering energy to thicken, to harden, to become a wall. The air in front of him grew heavy, charged with static that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up. He was not just holding a spell, he was holding a barricade against a mountain-sized force that showed no sign of slowing its advance. The barrier groaned. A sharp, high-pitched whine vibrated through the clearing as the dragon pressed its weight against the shimmering wall. Darius held his ground, but his posture began to buckle. A hairline fracture appeared in the center of the translucent plane, glowing with a frantic, erratic pulse. He tried to seal it, his fingers dancing through the air, but the energy was fraying. The light turned a sickly, washed-out gray. Then, the fracture widened. A sound like shattering crystal tore through the air, deafening and sudden. The barrier did not just fade. It disintegrated into thousands of sparks that vanished before hitting the ground. The sudden release of pressure sent Darius stumbling backward, his momentum carrying him into the dirt. He had no time to recover. The dragon, sensing the void where the protection had been, lunged forward with terrifying speed. Its massive head swept past the empty space, snapping its jaws in a display of raw, unrestrained power. The heat intensified, rushing over them like the blast from a furnace. With the shield gone, there was nothing left to deflect the incoming strike. They were exposed, vulnerable, and directly in the path of the beast's next movement. The dragon pulled its head back, the muscles in its neck bunching for a final, lethal strike. A low rumble built in its chest, vibrating through the jagged cliff face and rattling the very air. Jacqueline watched the beast, her fingers white-knuckled around the edges of her spellbook. The text on the pages swirled, the ink bleeding into useless, chaotic patterns. She shouted a defensive incantation, but the words died in her throat, swallowed by the heat. She looked at the book, then at the shadow looming over them. With a sharp, decisive motion, she slammed the heavy tome onto the stone desk. It skidded across the surface and fell into the dust. She did not look back. She pivoted, her boots sliding on the loose scree as she moved away from the others. The dragon opened its maw, a flicker of molten light igniting deep within its throat. Jacqueline saw the intent in its eyes. She abandoned the stance of a student, abandoned the patterns she had spent years memorizing. She lunged forward, dropping hard onto her knees. The impact jarred her, but she ignored the pain. She pressed her palms flat against the cold, unyielding rock of the mountain, fingers spreading wide to seek the hidden pulse buried beneath the surface. The dragon roared again, a sound so violent it cracked the air, but Jacqueline kept her eyes locked on the stone beneath her palms. She ignored the heat radiating from the beast. She ignored the frantic shouts of her companions behind her. She pushed her fingers deeper into the fissures of the mountain, feeling the grit of ancient dust and the jagged edges of the bedrock. At first, there was only cold, dead stone. She took a steady breath, exhaled, and forced her awareness to descend. She pushed through the surface layer, seeking the rhythm buried under centuries of silence. Slowly, it began. A tremor, faint as a heartbeat, pulsed against her skin. It was steady, heavy, and immense. She pressed harder, her shoulders tensing as she channeled every ounce of her concentration into the contact. The mountain was not just rock. It was a living record of everything that had passed before. The pulse grew stronger, matching the rhythm of her own blood. She felt the depth of the peaks, the vastness of the stone roots, and the slow, grinding movement of the earth's core. She was no longer a student in a simulation. She was an extension of the mountain itself. The chaos of the battle faded, replaced by the deep, resonant thrum of the world beneath her. The mountain answered her. A low, grinding shriek echoed from deep within the fissures under her palms. Thin veins of frost began to spiderweb across the stone, spreading rapidly from where she touched the ground. She did not pull away. Instead, she pushed her will into those cracks, forcing the pressure of the earth to release. A sudden, violent hiss erupted from the mountain floor, like a geyser of pressurized vapor. Within seconds, a thick, silver mist surged upward, rolling across the cliff face in a dense, swirling curtain. It was heavy, damp, and cold, clinging to the jagged rocks and filling the air with a blinding, opaque haze. The dragon, mid-lunge, faltered. It swung its massive head, snapping at empty air, its golden scales dulling as the moisture settled over them. The beast slowed, its movements becoming erratic and sluggish as it lost its target in the swirling white wall. The heat radiating from its body collided with the freezing vapor, creating a low, bubbling roar that vibrated through the ground. The creature circled, claws scraping blindly against the stone, unable to pierce the shroud. Jacqueline remained motionless, her breath visible in the freezing air, her gaze fixed on the shifting wall of silver that now shielded them from the predator. The silver mist churned, thick and viscous, turning the battlefield into a featureless white void. The dragon continued to roar, but the sound was muffled, distant, as if the fog itself were absorbing the violence of the encounter. Then, the scraping of claws against stone ceased. A new sound emerged from the center of the white wall, a crisp, rhythmic clatter, steady as a heartbeat. It did not sound like the heavy, dragging weight of a beast. It was light, precise, and resonant. Jacqueline pulled her hands from the stone, her palms stained with cold, damp earth, and watched the mist begin to ripple. The air temperature plummeted further. The swirling vapor parted, pushed aside by a presence that defied the chaos of the simulation. A creature stepped forward, its frame outlined in a pale, ethereal luminescence that cut through the haze. It was a unicorn. Its movement was fluid, ignoring the jagged terrain that had hampered the others. From the tip of its spiraling horn, a blinding, celestial silver light ignited, pulsing with an intensity that burned white against the gray fog. The dragon recoiled, its golden scales dimming in the presence of the radiance. The unicorn stopped, its hooves planted firmly on the cliff edge, and the entire battlefield fell into a sudden, absolute stillness. The unicorn stood perfectly still, its silver horn casting long, sharp shadows against the cliff wall. It did not look at the dragon. It looked only at Jacqueline. The creature stepped forward, its hooves making no sound on the uneven rock. It moved with a deliberate, measured gait, closing the gap between them until the light from its horn bathed Jacqueline's face in a pale, sterile glow. The air around them began to vibrate, a low hum that rattled the loose gravel near their feet. The dragon let out a sharp, jagged hiss, but the creature ignored the sound entirely. It lowered its head, the spiraling horn descending slowly until the tip pressed firmly against the center of Jacqueline's forehead. At the point of contact, the air warped. A visible ripple of pure, white energy pulsed outward from the touch, a shockwave of light that flattened the surrounding mist. The ground beneath them cracked in a perfect circle, the stone turning to fine, gray dust. Jacqueline did not move. She kept her eyes open, watching the light from the horn flow into her skin like liquid mercury. The energy rippled through the air, distorting the horizon and turning the sky above the peaks into a blinding, featureless white. The contact held. A torrent of cold, white fire surged from the horn into Jacqueline's skull. It was not a gentle infusion. It was a physical weight, a massive displacement of force that slammed into her nervous system. She gasped, her chest arching as the energy tore through her veins, turning her pulse into a rhythmic, blinding throb. Around her, the air grew heavy, ionized, and smelling of ozone. Her hair lifted, whipping violently in a vacuum of her own making, snapping against her face like a lash. Each strand stood on end, haloed by flickering static. She pressed her palms into the stone floor, her knuckles turning white, but the rock beneath her began to liquefy under the sheer intensity of the conduit. The ground groaned, a deep, tectonic sound that vibrated through her marrow. She tried to exhale, but the air was gone, replaced by the crushing density of the ancient magic. Her skin flushed with a faint, iridescent glow, the light pulsing in time with the unicorn's own horn. She was no longer just a conduit. She was a lightning rod, grounding the history of the peaks into the very earth of the training hall. The simulation flickered, the edges of the reality-bending spell fraying as the raw, untamed power demanded release. The white fire receded, pulling back from the surface of her skin into the core of her being. Jacqueline exhaled, the sound sharp and rhythmic. She placed her palms flat against the softened stone, pushed, and rose to her feet in one fluid motion. The ground beneath her boots remained fused, transformed by the heat of the previous seconds. She held her position, spine rigid, and opened her eyes. The pupils had vanished, replaced by a steady, incandescent glow that mirrored the intensity of the unicorn's horn. She did not blink. She did not sway. The dragon, mid-dive, caught the shift in the air. It banked hard, its massive wings beating against the cliff face, sending showers of shattered rock down into the gorge. It hesitated, hovering in the thin air, its golden scales dulling as it locked its gaze onto hers. The creature let out a low, vibrating rumble that shook the remaining pillars of the training hall, but it did not close the distance. It retreated, climbing higher into the simulation's sky, driven back by the sheer pressure emanating from her steady, burning stare. Jacqueline stood firm, her gaze tracking the dragon's every adjustment, her posture radiating a cold, calculated precision that silenced the howling wind of the peaks. Jacqueline raised her right hand, fingers splayed as if gripping the very fabric of the air. She pulled downward, dragging a shimmering, viscous trail of light from the atmosphere itself. The space between her palm and the sky groaned, a sound like tearing metal. She twisted her wrist, and the air splintered, spider-webbing into jagged fissures of silver. The simulation fought her. The sky surged with a sudden, violent turbulence, trying to collapse the spell, but she pivoted her stance, locking her heels into the stone. She did not waver. She brought her left hand up, slamming it against her right forearm, and the connection snapped into place. A massive, complex lattice of silver light erupted from her fingertips, expanding outward with a deafening crackle. It was a geometric weave, precise and unrelenting, glowing with the intensity of a dying star. She thrust both hands toward the zenith, driving the construct upward. The silver web cut through the clouds, trailing sparks that hissed as they hit the ground. She held the pose, her muscles corded and rigid, forcing the raw, brilliant energy to hold its form against the crushing pressure of the simulation. The silver lattice slammed into the dragon, the impact audible as a thunderous boom that echoed across the peaks. The web expanded instantly, wrapping around the beast like molten metal cooling into iron shackles. The dragon roared, a sound that tore through the simulated atmosphere and thrashed its massive wings against the restraint. Each movement caused the sky to ripple, the very pixels of the reality bending under the strain of the struggle. Jacqueline held her position, her arms locked, feeding the construct with every ounce of her focus. The dragon's golden scales scraped against the silver bonds, throwing showers of sparks that rained down like burning embers. It tried to dive, but the force of the spell anchored it in place, pulling it backward against its own momentum. The beast's neck arched, its jaws snapping at the invisible pressure, holding it suspended in the air. Slowly, the thrashing diminished. The wings stopped their frantic beating. The dragon hung motionless, pinned against the jagged horizon, its body suspended in the lattice. The simulation groaned, the cliffs vibrating, but the beast remained trapped, held fast in the center of the silver web. Jacqueline maintained the tension, her breathing steady, watching as the creature's immense form remained frozen in the sky. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the silver lattice holding the beast aloft. Tyke pushed himself up from the loose shale, his hands scraping against the jagged cliff face. He shook his head, clearing the grit from his eyes, and stood on unsteady legs. He scanned the immediate area, his boots sliding slightly on the unstable ground, before his focus shifted to the center of the clearing. He saw Jacqueline. She remained grounded, her palms still pressed firmly into the earth, maintaining the connection that kept the dragon suspended. Tyke took a single step toward her, his movements cautious, as if afraid to break the fragile architecture of the spell. He stopped 3 paces away. He turned his head, locking his gaze with hers. The air between them felt dense, charged with the lingering residue of the magic she had pulled from the mountain. He did not speak. His eyes moved from her hands to the shimmering web above, then back to her face. He shifted his weight, his stance tightening, his posture no longer that of a student in a training hall. He looked at her, and in that exchange, the distance between their previous understanding of the world and the reality of their current power vanished. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, acknowledging the change. The dragon did not move. The silver lattice glowed with a blinding intensity, then suddenly fractured. Lines of white light tore through the sky, segmenting the horizon into jagged, pixelated shards. The mountain peaks dissolved like salt in water. The ground beneath their feet lost its texture, shifting from gritty, uneven shale to the smooth, unyielding surface of the training floor. The roar of the beast cut off abruptly, replaced by the hollow, ringing silence of the academy. Jacqueline's hands jerked back from the floor as the connection snapped. She sat on the cold stone, the remnants of the mountain wind still ghosting across her skin. Tyke stumbled as the cliff face he was leaning against vanished, leaving him standing on flat, polished granite. Darius stood a few feet away, his staff motionless, the magical field that had sustained their surroundings gone. The air in the hall felt thin and stagnant compared to the sharp, biting cold of the peaks. They were back. The holographic dragon was gone, the burning castle had faded, and the high-altitude light was replaced by the dim, artificial glow of the academy lamps. Every breath they took felt heavy in the sudden stillness. They stood in the center of the hall, their bodies still reacting to the phantom pressure of the simulation, while the reality of the stone floor solidified beneath their boots. The silence in the training hall was absolute. It pressed against their ears, thick and suffocating. Jacqueline remained on the floor for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her fingers tracing the grain of the stone as if searching for the mountain's pulse. Tyke stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling in sharp, rhythmic bursts. Darius stared at his own hands, his knuckles white from the strain of holding his staff. None of them moved. They were waiting for a reaction, a shout, or a correction. But the hall remained empty of sound. Slowly, they looked up toward the observation balcony. 3 instructors stood there, their silhouettes framed against the dim, flickering lamps of the upper gallery. They did not applaud. They did not move. Their faces were carved from the same cold stone as the floor beneath the students' feet. One instructor leaned forward, hands clasped behind their back, eyes narrowing as they scrutinized the trio below. It was a gaze that stripped away the pretense of the lesson, looking directly into the shift that had just occurred in the simulation. The lack of commentary felt more dangerous than a direct rebuke. The instructors turned, their movements synchronized and deliberate, and walked into the shadows of the mezzanine. The silence they left behind was not a void, it was a verdict. The academy at night was a graveyard of echoes. Jacqueline moved through the corridors, her footsteps muffled by the thick stone walls. She avoided the main thoroughfares where the moonlight spilled in sharp, revealing lines. Reaching the library door, she pressed her palm against the wood, feeling the faint hum of the locking ward. She whispered a sequence of words, the air rippling as the seal dissolved. Inside, the shelves stretched into the darkness like the ribs of a giant beast. The smell of dust and decaying parchment hit her. She navigated the narrow aisles, her heart drumming against her ribs. A sound echoed from the far end of the hall, the rhythmic tap of a guard's staff on the tile. She ducked behind a heavy oak desk, holding her breath until the sound faded into the distance. Silence returned, heavier than before. She crawled toward the center of the room, near the archives of the ancient maps. She knelt, her fingers finding the edge of a loose stone slab near the base of the shelves. She pried at the wood, the floorboards groaning in protest. She pulled, the wood splintering slightly under her grip, revealing the dark, hollow space beneath. The hollow space beneath the floorboards was colder than the room above. Jacqueline reached into the dark, her fingers brushing against something sharp. A thin, biting frost crawled up her wrist, a dormant trap set to protect whatever lay inside. She gritted her teeth, refusing to pull back. She tapped into the same energy that had anchored the dragon, pushing a steady, grounding force into the wood. The frost shattered, turning into fine, sparkling dust that drifted away into the dark. Her hand closed around a cylinder of hardened leather. She pulled it into the dim light of the library. The surface was cool, smelling of ozone and ancient mountain air. She unrolled it. The parchment was brittle, covered in ink that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow. It was not just a map, it was a living guide. Lines of silver traced the route through the whispering peaks, winding past frozen waterfalls and through mountain passes that did not exist on any official academy chart. At the center of the parchment, a mark shimmered, a stylized wing, pointing toward the sanctuary of the last surviving griffins. The ink shifted as she watched, the path realigning itself to show the current terrain. She had found it. Jacqueline moved back through the silent halls, the leather scroll pressed tight against her side. She entered the dormitory, the air thick with the stillness of deep night. Tyke was seated at the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, while Darius stood near the window, watching the horizon. They turned as the door clicked shut. She did not speak. She simply laid the map out on the central table. The silver ink flared, projecting the route directly into the dim air of the room. Tyke stood up, his eyes tracing the path past the peaks. He looked at the map, then at Jacqueline, his jaw tightening. Darius stepped forward, his hand hovering over the glowing lines, his expression shifting from caution to sudden, sharp clarity. There was no need for debate. The academy walls felt smaller now, a cage they had outgrown. Jacqueline gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She looked at each of them in turn, waiting for a sign. Tyke nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement that signaled his absolute commitment. Darius exhaled, his shoulders dropping as he reached for his gear. They stood in the center of the room, three figures bound by the same secret. They were no longer students of the academy. They were guardians of the path. They moved through the shadows of the dormitory wing, keeping their footsteps light against the cold floor. Every creak of the floorboards echoed like a bell in the dead air. Jacqueline led the way, her hand brushing the walls to navigate by touch. They reached the main gate, a massive iron structure that separated the academy from the wild expanse of the outer world. Tyke stepped forward, his breathing measured. He gripped the iron bars, the metal biting into his palms. The lock was ancient, rusted, solid, but Darius placed his staff against the mechanism. A soft, rhythmic hum vibrated through the stone floor, and with a metallic groan, the tumblers shifted. The gate swung outward, revealing a path framed by the silver glow of the moon. Jacqueline crossed the threshold first, her boots hitting the damp earth of the exterior trail. Tyke followed, then Darius, who paused for a heartbeat to look back at the dark, silent windows of the library. Nobody spoke. The air outside was sharp, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. They turned their backs on the stone arches of the academy. The gate creaked shut behind them, the sound final and absolute. Their old lives had ended at that threshold, and the night air felt like a promise of things yet to come. The path ahead wound through dense brush, the terrain rising sharply toward the jagged silhouette of the distant mountains. Jacqueline walked with her head down, counting her steps to keep a steady rhythm against the uneven ground. Behind her, Tyke and Darius maintained a tight formation, their eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of pursuit. The academy was already a smudge of gray against the night sky, shrinking with every 100 yards they gained. They reached a rocky ridge and stopped. Below them, the world opened up into an endless expanse of shadows and starlight. The horizon was no longer a theoretical line on a map, but a physical boundary they had to cross. Jacqueline pointed toward the faint, silver-tinged glow flickering in the far distance. It was not a fire, but the pulse of the wild, calling out to the history they carried in their minds. Tyke gripped his staff, his knuckles white, and nodded once. There was no hesitation left in his posture. Darius stepped to the edge of the ridge, his breath visible in the cooling air. He looked at the vast landscape, then back at his companions. They were no longer reading about the legends of the past. They were walking directly into the center of them. They moved down the slope, their boots crunching on loose gravel, heading straight for the unknown. The valley floor was a labyrinth of tall, swaying grass that brushed against their legs with every stride. Jacqueline felt the map, a solid presence in her pack, grounding her focus. The fear that had defined their departure began to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, persistent pressure in her chest. She stopped, turning her face into the wind. It was not just air. It carried the faint, metallic scent of ancient stone and static. She looked at Tyke and Darius. The hesitation that had lingered in their movements earlier was gone. The heavy history they had studied in the academy, the names, the dates, the fallen empires no longer felt like a burden pressing them into the dirt. Instead, it aligned. It pulled at them like a lodestone. Darius raised his staff, and the wood glowed with a soft, steady light. Not from a spell, but from the resonance of the land itself. The path ahead was no longer hidden by the dark. Every step they took was pulled toward a specific point on the horizon. They were not wandering. They were following a signal that only they could hear. They moved forward in unison, their pace quickening as the weight of their heritage transformed into a clear, unwavering compass. They did not look back. Their path was set, and their destiny waited in the silence of the mountains.